Welcome, everyone, to a story that will chill you to the bone and make you question the placid surfaces of everyday life. We often believe the most monstrous acts come with loud, chaotic warnings. But what if the most terrifying evil is the one that whispers? The one that smiles at you from across the street, that bakes cookies for the neighborhood bake sale, that plans a wedding with loving, meticulous detail. Today, we delve into a tale of calculated malevolence, a story of a bride whose cold precision allowed her to orchestrate a symphony of death, undetected, for 17 long years. This is the story of the cold-blooded bride 9 murders, one perfectly hidden plan, and 17 years of silent terror. Before we pull back the curtain on this horrifying chronicle, make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the shocking conclusion to this tale, or any of our other journeys into the heart of darkness. Now let us begin. In 1998, the small, idyllic town of Oakhaven, nestled in the rolling hills of Northern California, was the picture of Rockwellian perfection. Life here moved at a slower pace. Neighbors knew each other by name, and the most pressing news was usually about the upcoming county fair or the high school football team's latest victory. It was the kind of town where people felt safe, where doors were often left unlocked, and where the notion of a predator lurking in their midst was the stuff of fiction, not reality. It was in this cradle of tranquility that Eleanor Vance, a woman as striking in her beauty as she was reserved in her demeanor, was preparing for her wedding. Eleanor, by all accounts, was the perfect bride. She was set to marry the town's golden boy, Jonathan Hayes, a handsome and charismatic man from a well-respected family. Their love story was the talk of the town, a seemingly fairy tale romance culminating in a planned summer wedding at the picturesque Oakhaven Community Church. Eleanor, with her quiet grace and impeccable taste, was the architect of this perfect union, meticulously planning every detail, from the delicate lace on her wedding gown to the exact shade of the roses that would adorn the reception hall. But beneath the serene exterior of the blushing bride, a cold, methodical mind was at work, laying the groundwork for a plan so audacious, so diabolical, that it would remain hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. The first thread in this tapestry of terror was woven just 3 months before the wedding, with the sudden and tragic death of Jonathan's grandmother, Beatrice Hayes. Beatrice was the matriarch of the Hayes family, a woman of considerable wealth and influence in Oakhaven. She was known for her sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, and she made no secret of her reservations about Jonathan's choice of bride. Beatrice, a woman who prided herself on her shrewd judgment of character, had seen something in Eleanor that unsettled her, a coldness in her eyes that contradicted her gentle smile. She had tried to warn Jonathan, to get him to see beyond the beautiful facade, but her grandson, blinded by love, had dismissed her concerns as the ramblings of an overprotective old woman. Beatrice's death was officially ruled a heart attack. She was found in her grand Victorian home, sitting in her favorite armchair, a book resting in her lap. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. The town mourned the passing of a local legend, and the Hayes family, though heartbroken, found solace in the belief that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Eleanor was the picture of grief, a pillar of support for the devastated Jonathan, her quiet strength and unwavering composure earning her the admiration of the entire community. No one questioned the official cause of death. No one saw the glint of triumph in Eleanor's eyes as she stood beside Jonathan at the funeral, the perfect, grieving fiancé. The truth, however, was far more sinister. Beatrice Hayes was the first victim of the cold-blooded bride. Eleanor, who had been a chemistry student in her college years, had synthesized a potent, fast-acting poison that mimicked the symptoms of a major coronary event. It was a poison that was virtually untraceable, leaving no residue in the bloodstream after a few short hours. She had administered it to Beatrice in her afternoon tea, a ritual that Eleanor had dutifully observed with her future grandmother-in-law in the weeks leading up to her death. It was an act of calculated cruelty, a preemptive strike against the one person who might have had the insight to unravel her carefully constructed plans. With Beatrice out of the way, the path to the Hayes family fortune was clear. Eleanor's plan was not simply to marry into wealth. It was about total and absolute control. She saw the Hayes family as a means to an end, a stepping stone to a life of power and influence that she had always craved. Jonathan, with his trusting nature and deep love for her, was the perfect pawn in her deadly game. The wedding went on as planned, a beautiful and joyous occasion that served as a welcome respite from the recent tragedy. Eleanor, radiant in her white gown, exchanged vows with Jonathan, promising to love and cherish him until death did them part. For Eleanor, that promise was not a sacred oath, but a chilling premonition. The early years of their marriage were a picture of domestic bliss. Eleanor settled into the role of the perfect wife, managing the household with an efficiency that was both admired and slightly intimidating. She was a gracious hostess, a devoted spouse, and a doting mother to their 2 children, a boy and a girl, who were born in quick succession. The Hayes family, once wary of her, now embraced her as one of their own. She had won them over with her charm, her intelligence, and her unwavering devotion to Jonathan. But the silence that had settled over Oakhaven was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a predator stalking its prey. The second murder came 2 years after the wedding, and this time, the victim was Jonathan's uncle, the man who managed the family's extensive business empire. He was a shrewd and intelligent man, and he had begun to notice irregularities in the company's finances, small but significant sums of money that seemed to be disappearing without a trace. He had voiced his concerns to Jonathan, but his nephew, completely enthralled by Eleanor, had brushed them aside. The uncle's death was as sudden and unexpected as Beatrice's. He was an avid fisherman, and his boat was found capsized in the middle of Oakhaven Lake. His body was recovered a few days later, and the coroner ruled his death an accidental drowning. The town was shocked and saddened by the tragedy, and once again, Eleanor was the rock to which her grieving husband clung. The truth, of course, was far more diabolical. Eleanor had sabotaged the boat, creating a slow leak that would have gone unnoticed until it was too late. She had also tampered with his life vest, ensuring that it would fail to inflate when he needed it most. She had watched from the shore, a hidden observer, as her plan unfolded with cold precision. With the uncle gone, control of the Hayes family business fell to Jonathan, who, at Eleanor's gentle but firm suggestion, appointed a new financial officer, a man who, unbeknownst to anyone, was a pawn in Eleanor's game. The siphoning of the family's assets began in earnest, a slow and steady bleed that would go undetected for years. The years that followed were marked by a series of accidents and natural deaths that, taken individually, seemed tragic but unsuspicious. A cousin who had been a vocal critic of Jonathan's business decisions died in a car crash, his brakes having mysteriously failed. An elderly, infirm aunt passed away from a sudden and virulent strain of pneumonia, a strain that was later discovered to have been cultivated in a makeshift lab in the basement of the Hayes home. With each death, Eleanor's control over the family and its fortune grew stronger. She was the puppet master, pulling the strings with a cold, calculated precision. She was always there to offer a shoulder to cry on, a word of comfort, a helping hand. She was the picture of empathy and compassion, and no one, not even her husband, suspected the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. The town of Oakhaven, once a symbol of safety and security, had become a hunting ground for a predator who moved among them, unseen and unsuspected. The 17 years of silent terror had begun, and the cold-blooded bride, with her perfectly hidden plan, was just getting started. The first chapter of her reign of terror had been written in the blood of those who stood in her way, and the chapters to come would be even more chilling, more audacious, and more deadly. The silence that had fallen over Oakhaven was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a fear that had not yet found its voice. It was a fear that would fester and grow, a silent scream that would eventually shatter the idyllic facade of the town and reveal the monster that had been living among them all along. The emergence of the predator was complete, but the full extent of her depravity was yet to be revealed. The perfectly woven tapestry of lies and deceit was about to be unraveled, and the town of Oakhaven would never be the same again. The years rolled on in Oakhaven, each passing season marked by a quiet, almost imperceptible sense of unease. The string of tragedies that had befallen the Hayes family was the subject of hushed whispers at the local diner and sad shakes of the head at the community church. The townspeople, in their simple, trusting nature, attributed the series of deaths to a cruel twist of fate, a dark cloud of misfortune that had settled over one of their most prominent families. They saw Eleanor, the ever-present, ever-grieving matriarch, as a figure of tragic strength, a woman who had endured an unimaginable amount of loss with a grace and fortitude that was nothing short of heroic. They did not see the architect of their sorrow. They saw a fellow victim, and that was precisely how Eleanor wanted it. Her plan, her beautiful, intricate, deadly plan, was a symphony of deception, and she was its maestro. Each death was a carefully orchestrated note in her macabre masterpiece, a note that, on its own, sounded like a tragic accident or a natural passing, but when woven together, created a chilling melody of murder and manipulation. The fourth, fifth, and sixth murders were a testament to her evolving artistry. She had moved beyond the simple, direct methods of her earlier work and had graduated to a level of sophistication that was as brilliant as it was terrifying. She had learned to play on the fears and weaknesses of her victims, to use their own lives as the instruments of their destruction. The fourth victim was a distant cousin of Jonathan's, a man with a known gambling problem. He had been a thorn in Eleanor's side for years, his constant requests for loans, and his veiled threats about revealing certain family secrets, a nuisance she was no longer willing to tolerate. His death, when it came, was a tragic but not entirely unexpected event. He was found in his car, on a secluded lover's lane, the engine running and a hose leading from the exhaust pipe into the interior. The police ruled it a suicide, a man who had finally succumbed to the weight of his debts and his demons. The note he left behind, a rambling confession of his failures and a plea for forgiveness, was so convincing, so full of despair, that no one questioned its authenticity. But the note, like the death itself, was a forgery, a product of Eleanor's meticulous planning. She had spent months studying the cousin's handwriting, his turn of phrase, his unique brand of melancholy self-pity. She had crafted a perfect replica of his despair, a final, poignant note that would serve as the closing act of his tragic life. The hose, the secluded location, the timing of it alit was all her design, a carefully constructed stage on which her victim would play his final, unwitting role. The fifth victim was a business partner of Jonathan's, a man who had grown increasingly suspicious of the company's financial dealings. He had started asking questions, probing into the labyrinthine network of shell corporations and offshore accounts that Eleanor had created to launder the Hayes family fortune. He was a smart man, a man who was getting too close to the truth, and for that he had to be silenced. His death was a stroke of genius, a testament to Eleanor's ability to turn the mundane into the murderous. He was a man with a severe peanut allergy, a fact that Eleanor had learned through casual conversation at a company dinner party. A few weeks later, he was dead, the victim of a massive anaphylactic shock. The official story was that he had accidentally eaten a cookie from a gift basket that had been sent to his office, a cookie that, unbeknownst to him, contained peanut oil. The gift basket, of course, had been sent by Eleanor, a seemingly harmless gesture of goodwill that was, in fact, a death sentence. There was no way to trace it back to her, no evidence to suggest that it was anything other than a tragic accident. The sixth victim was Jonathan's sister, a vibrant, free-spirited woman who had always been a source of light and laughter in the Hayes family. She was also the one person who had never truly warmed to Eleanor, the one person who still harbored a flicker of the same suspicion that their grandmother, Beatrice, had harbored so many years ago. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about her sister-in-law's perfect composure, her unwavering control, that unsettled her. She had tried to talk to Jonathan about it, to voice her vague, formless fears, but he had dismissed her concerns, just as he had dismissed their grandmother's. Her death was perhaps the most cruel, the most personal of them all. She was an avid equestrian, a skilled rider who spent every spare moment at the local stables. Her accident occurred during a morning ride, her horse, a normally gentle and well-behaved animal, suddenly spooking, rearing up, and throwing her to the ground. She died instantly of a broken neck. The town mourned the loss of a beautiful young life, and Jonathan was inconsolable. Eleanor, once again, was the pillar of strength, the calming presence in the eye of the storm. But she was not the comforter. She was the storm. She had spent weeks secretly visiting the stables, feeding the horse a cocktail of drugs that would make it skittish and unpredictable. She had carefully chosen the day, the time, the location, ensuring that her sister-in-law would be riding alone on a particularly treacherous stretch of trail. With each death, Eleanor's web of control grew tighter. She had systematically eliminated anyone who posed a threat to her, anyone who stood in the way of her ultimate goal, the complete and utter absorption of the Hayes family fortune. She had become a ghost, a phantom killer who left no tracks, no evidence, no witnesses. She was a master of the long game, a patient and methodical predator who was willing to wait years for her plans to come to fruition. The 17 years of silent terror was not just about the murders. It was about the psychological warfare that Eleanor waged on the surviving members of the Hayes family and the town of Oakhaven itself. She had created a climate of fear and suspicion, a world where no one felt safe, where even the most mundane aspects of life could become instruments of death. She had turned the idyllic facade of the town into a house of horrors, a place where the smiling neighbor could be a cold-blooded killer. And what of Jonathan, the man at the center of this web of deception, the man who had unwittingly married a monster? He was a broken man, a shadow of his former self. The series of tragedies that had befallen his family had taken their toll, leaving him emotionally and psychologically scarred. He had become completely dependent on Eleanor, on her strength, her guidance, her unwavering love. He was a puppet, and she was the puppet master, and he was completely unaware of the strings that controlled his every move. The symphony of deception was nearing its crescendo. The final notes had yet to be played, the final victims had yet to be chosen. The cold-blooded bride, the architect of this reign of terror, was not finished yet. She had one more act to perform, one final, shocking revelation that would shatter the silence of Oakhaven and expose the monster that had been hiding in plain sight for 17 long years. The town was a powder keg of fear and suspicion, and the spark that would ignite it was about to be struck. The melody of murder was about to reach its final, terrifying chord, and the world would finally hear the silent scream that had been echoing through the hills of Oakhaven for nearly 2 decades. The perfect plan was about to be revealed, and the fallout would be more devastating than anyone could have ever imagined. For 17 years, Eleanor Hayes had been the conductor of a silent symphony of death, the master composer of a perfectly hidden plan. She had moved through the lives of the people of Oakhaven like a phantom, a specter of death and despair, leaving a trail of bodies in her wake. She had been the grieving widow, the supportive sister, the loving mother, all while hiding the heart of a cold-blooded killer beneath a flawless veneer of respectability. But even the most meticulously constructed plans have flaws, hidden stress fractures that, under the right pressure, can bring the entire structure crashing down. And for Eleanor, that pressure came from a source she had never anticipated. Her own son. David Hayes, the eldest child of Eleanor and Jonathan, had grown up in the shadow of death. He had attended more funerals by the age of 16 than most people do in a lifetime. He had watched his father, once a vibrant and charismatic man, wither into a hollow shell of his former self. He had seen the fear and suspicion that had taken root in his town, the way people looked at his family with a mixture of pity and a strange, unspoken dread. And through it all, he had watched his mother, the unflappable, unbreakable Eleanor, the one constant in his life of chaos and loss. But as David grew older, his admiration for his mother's strength began to curdle into a quiet, gnawing suspicion. He started to notice the little things, the inconsistencies, the fleeting moments when his mother's perfect mask would slip, revealing a glimpse of the cold, calculating mind that lay beneath. He noticed the way she never seemed to truly grieve, the way her eyes remained dry and clear while everyone around her was weeping. He noticed the way she would subtly manipulate conversations, steering them away from any topic that might lead to uncomfortable questions. He noticed the way she seemed to know things she shouldn't have known, to anticipate events with an almost preternatural accuracy. The turning point for David came when he was home from college for the summer. He had been going through some of his great-grandmother Beatrice's old belongings, boxes of letters and diaries that had been stored in the attic. He stumbled upon an entry in his great-grandmother's journal, written just a few weeks before her death, in which she described her growing unease about Eleanor. She wrote of a coldness in her future daughter-in-law's eyes, a lack of genuine emotion that she found deeply disturbing. She had even gone so far as to say that she feared for her grandson's safety. The words sent a chill down David's spine. It was as if his great-grandmother was speaking to him from beyond the grave, confirming the vague, formless fears that had been haunting him for years. He began to dig deeper, to piece together the puzzle of his family's tragic history. He researched the deaths of his relatives, poring over old newspaper articles and police reports. He began to see a pattern, a series of accidents and natural deaths that, when viewed in succession, seemed anything but. His investigation led him to the 7th, 8th, and 9th murders, the final, audacious acts of a predator who had grown bolder, more confident, with each successful kill. The 7th victim was the family lawyer, a man who had been with the Hayes family for decades. He was the man who had drafted Beatrice's will, a will that, David discovered, had been mysteriously changed just days before her death, leaving the bulk of her estate to Jonathan and, by extension, to Eleanor. The lawyer had died of a massive, sudden stroke, another natural death that, in the light of David's growing suspicion, seemed anything but. The 8th and 9th victims were a married couple, old friends of the Hayes family who had been with them the night their uncle had accidentally drowned. They had always been haunted by that night, by the feeling that something was not right, that the official story didn't add up. They had started talking, sharing their suspicions with others, and for that they had been silenced. Their deaths were a masterpiece of misdirection, a car crash that had been made to look like a drunk driving accident. The police found a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the car, and the husband's blood alcohol level was well over the legal limit. But David, in his relentless search for the truth, discovered that the husband was a recovering alcoholic who hadn't had a drink in over 10 years. The pieces were all there, a horrifying mosaic of murder and deception. But David knew that he needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. He needed to find a way to expose his mother, to bring her to justice for the 17 years of silent terror she had inflicted upon their family and their town. His opportunity came in the form of a family dinner, a seemingly innocuous gathering that would become the final, dramatic act in Eleanor's reign of terror. David, with the help of a trusted friend who was a tech expert, had rigged the house with a series of hidden cameras and microphones. He had also, in a move that was as brave as it was reckless, decided to confront his mother, to force her to confess to her crimes. The confrontation was explosive. David laid out his evidence, piece by piece, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. At first, Eleanor denied everything, her face a mask of shocked indignation. She accused him of being paranoid, of being ungrateful, of trying to destroy their family. But as David continued, as he presented her with the irrefutable evidence of her guilt, her composure began to crack. The mask began to slip, and for the first time, David saw the monster that his mother truly was. In a final, chilling monologue, Eleanor confessed to everything. She spoke of the 9 murders, of her perfectly hidden plan, of her 17 years of silent terror. She spoke of it all with a cold, detached pride, as if she were describing a work of art, a masterpiece of her own creation. She showed no remorse, no guilt, no emotion at all, save for a flicker of annoyance that her brilliant plan had been unraveled by her own son. The confession was captured on camera, every damning word recorded for the world to see. The police were called, and Eleanor Hayes, the cold-blooded bride, was arrested in her own home, in front of her shattered husband and her 2 children. The 17 years of silent terror were finally over. The perfectly hidden plan had been brought to light, and the town of Oakhaven was left to grapple with the horrifying truth that the monster they had feared had been living among them all along, disguised as a loving wife, a doting mother, and a pillar of the community. The silence was broken, replaced by the wail of sirens and the shattering of a family, a town, and the illusion of safety that they had held so dear for so long. The symphony of deception had reached its final, discordant note, and the world would never forget the name of its composer, the cold-blooded bride. The arrest of Eleanor Hayes did not bring peace to Oakhaven. It shattered the silence with a deafening roar of revelation and horror. The flashing red and blue lights that sliced through the night of her confession served as a beacon, drawing the world's attention to the small, once tranquil town. The cold-blooded bride was no longer a whispered local fear but a national headline, a media sensation. Oakhaven became a pilgrimage site for morbid curiosity, its idyllic streets clogged with news vans and its residents hounded by reporters. The trial was a spectacle that stripped away the last vestiges of the town's innocence. Held in the county courthouse, it was the biggest event in Oakhaven's history. The prosecution, armed with David's chilling recordings and the subsequent forensic evidence unearthed from years of cold cases, laid out Eleanor's 17-year reign of terror in meticulous, horrifying detail. They exhumed bodies, presented long-forgotten autopsy reports in a new light, and traced the complex web of financial deceit that had funded Eleanor's perfect life. Throughout it all, Eleanor sat at the defendant's table, a picture of unnerving calm. She was not a broken woman facing justice. She was a queen observing the tedious dismantling of her kingdom. She showed no emotion as the prosecution detailed how she poisoned Beatrice, sabotaged her brother-in-law's boat, or cultivated a deadly virus in her own basement. Her face was a porcelain mask of indifference. When her own recorded voice filled the courtroom, a cold, clinical confession of 9 murders, she simply straightened the collar of her blouse, as if listening to a boring lecture. The most agonizing moments of the trial came from the testimonies of her own family. Jonathan Hayes, a ghost of the man he once was, took the stand. His body was frail, his eyes hollowed out by a grief that was too vast and too complex to comprehend. He spoke of his love for Eleanor, his complete and utter belief in her innocence for 2 decades. His testimony was not an accusation but a eulogy for a life that had been a lie, for a wife who had never existed. He broke down completely on the stand, his sobs the sound of a soul being torn apart. Then came David. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking to his own execution. He had to face his mother, whose cold eyes followed his every move, and recount the dawning horror of his discovery. His voice, thick with a sorrow that went beyond grief, detailed the clues, the diaries, the final confrontation. In the gallery, the townspeople were divided. Some saw him as a hero, the one person brave enough to stop the monster. Others, unable to reconcile the image of the perfect Hayes family, saw him as a betrayer, the son who had destroyed his own mother. He felt the weight of every stare, the burden of a truth that had cost him everything. His sister, Clara, refused to attend. She could not or would not accept the truth. In her mind, David had not uncovered a monster. He had created one. He had murdered the mother she loved, the woman who had tucked her in at night and helped her with her homework. Their bond was severed, replaced by Clara's bitter resentment. "You killed her," she had screamed at him after the arrest. "The mom we had. You killed her and left this monster in her place." The verdict was a formality. Guilty on 9 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, his face grim, sentenced her to 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As her fate was sealed, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched Eleanor's lips. It was not a smile of madness, but of victory. She had lost her freedom, but she had achieved a twisted form of immortality. She would be remembered. Her perfectly hidden plan was now, finally, visible to a masterpiece of malevolence she could claim as her own. The aftermath was a slow disintegration. Jonathan sold the house, that grand monument to his wife's deception, and disappeared from Oakhaven, unable to bear the weight of the memories and the pitying stares. Clara, after a tumultuous year, moved away to college, cutting off all contact with David, determined to build a life free from the taint of the Hayes name. David was left alone, the reluctant hero of a story he never wanted to be a part of. He too left Oakhaven, but he could never truly escape it. He was the boy who sent his mother to prison, a fact that would follow him for the rest of his life. He carried the guilt of his family's destruction, even as he knew he had done the only thing he could do. Years later, Oak Haven bore the scars of Eleanor's legacy. The trust that had once been the bedrock of the community was gone, replaced by a lingering suspicion. Doors were locked now. Neighbors eyed each other with a hint of caution. The Oak Haven wave, a friendly gesture once shared between passing cars, was a relic of a more innocent time. The story of the cold-blooded bride had become a dark local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children. Eleanor died in prison 2 decades later, an old woman who had never once expressed remorse. On his last visit to see her, compelled by a need for a closure he knew he would never get, David had asked her the one question that still haunted him. Why? Eleanor had looked at him, her eyes as cold and clear as they had been in the courtroom. Because I could, she said, her voice a dry whisper. Because it was easy. You see, David, most people are sheep. They see what they want to see. Your father wanted a perfect wife, so I gave him one. The town wanted to believe in fairy tales, so I wrote them one. It was all a performance. And it was perfect. That was her only explanation. There was no tragic backstory, no psychological trauma that had twisted her into a monster. She was simply empty, a void disguised as a person who had found meaning in control and creation, even if that creation was death. David finally understood. The terror had not been in the murders themselves, but in the silence that surrounded them, the silence of a town that refused to see the truth, the silence of a family blinded by love, and the chilling inner silence of a woman devoid of a soul. The reign of the cold-blooded bride was over. Her symphony of deception had ended, but its echo would resonate forever in the quiet, watchful streets of Oak Haven.